Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Guido Marchetti. I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time this morning to join us on our webinar. On this webinar today, we'll be discussing Windows Server 2003 migrations and the opportunity to transform your server infrastructure by looking at the different options that Microsoft can bring to you to replace your Windows Server 2003. So we'll kick on the process. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into the questions box. I'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Thank you. So we are now looking at end of support for Windows Server 2003 R2. It comes on the 14th of July, as you can see circled. So we literally have 20 days remaining. And Microsoft estimate that there'll be over 200 days worth of server migrations to be done and a number of application migrations that are going to have to take place over the next coming weeks, months, and potentially years in some cases, because it isn't as easy as some people would like to think it is to just move line of business applications, particularly when they're sitting on servers. So we'll talk a little bit about what the migration should be and what your strategy should be a little later on in the slide deck. So what does the news mean? It means that Microsoft will stop delivering updates. So there will literally be no more security updates. You can see quite recently there's been 37 updates released in 2013 for Windows Server 2003 R2, and they're critical updates. So they will be critical security patches, critical patches to maintain the performance of the server, so forth, so on. These will stop, which means over time, not immediately, but certainly over time, the performance of the machine will start to slow down and the security risk of the machine will become a higher risk, particularly if it's still networked into other machines. There are ways that you can kind of hive it off away from the live network and encapsulate it potentially, but certainly it's something to consider, because even within a virtual environment, it will become a frail element of the infrastructure. There'll be no compliance. Microsoft talk about a lack of compliance, so those who are using potentially e-commerce systems that are running it on obviously off Windows Server 2003, the requirement to move is very, very urgent, because you can see from that it will mean that Visa and MasterCard will no longer do business with the organization. And that's an agreement that they have in place with a number of people. I'm sure if your business has that element of infrastructure, you are fully aware of it. And there's no safe haven. Microsoft kind of being a bit strong about this, but there is no safe haven. The impact on both physical and virtualized servers I've already mentioned. Anybody running Small Business Server 2003, it is really critical that you start to look at that, because there is absolutely more than just Windows Server 2003 running on that. Your email architecture, potentially accounts packages, a huge amount of information is running on that server, and effectively it's vitally important that you look to upgrade that as soon as possible. Increased operational costs, and what we mean by that is that if something does go wrong on the Windows Server 2003, it will be a much higher cost to resolve that issue, because it's no longer supported. So from that point of view, partners like ourselves and other Microsoft partners are going to have no real way of looking after the infrastructure for you, and the costs will become significantly high, because there's nowhere to escalate for support. If we were to try and escalate an issue to Microsoft, Microsoft would simply respond and say that it's no longer a platform that is supported. And as you can see, a number of applications as well. So the applications that you'll be running, it could be Sage, it could be ebooks, it could be any type of application that you're running. A huge amount of other vendors and partners whose software you may already be using have decided now to say that they will no longer support Windows Server 2003 as well. So the time really is to act now, and it's really all about planning your migration. But it also, the planning of that migration from Windows Server 2003 offers you the opportunity now to start transforming, and Microsoft call it your data center. I would probably say transforming your IT infrastructure as opposed to a data center. Many of us have multiple servers, but quite a few of us have one or two servers, and we wouldn't refer to it as a data center. It's just our infrastructure. But it's very much an opportunity for you to start looking at different alternatives, some of which we'll talk about here today. So when we talk about data centers being transformed, we see 71% of companies see a rising demand for IT projects in 2013, and I think we've actually seen that as a partner. We have seen a steady growth coming along since kind of 2013 and the turn of that year, to investment being put back into IT infrastructure, with a large percentage, as you can see here, of CIOs looking to embrace a cloud-first strategy, IDC, say by 2016. That is already happening, particularly with a huge amount of applications like email, collaboration, and we're now seeing a very, very strong shift towards infrastructure as a service through Microsoft Azure, and organizations beginning to look at moving physical servers and virtual servers out into a hosted environment. And the final statistic we see is 45% of total IT services will be spent on cloud services by 2020. Be under no illusion that Microsoft, other key vendors such as Amazon, Google, even the hardware vendors like Dell, HP, IBM, they are all talking about cloud services. They are all talking about building infrastructure where you can then take your infrastructure and host it within theirs. There are different variations of cloud. I'm sure you've heard about the majority of them at this stage. The three key ones are public services, private services, and hybrid services. MJ Flood Technology specialise across all three, but we see massive adoption between SME and medium to large size enterprises, where it's a combination of public and on-site services, and we call that the hybrid model, where some of your infrastructure stays on-premise and some moves to public cloud services, for example, like Microsoft Office 365. So when we talk about the opportunity to transform your data center today, very, very much so, a huge amount of organizations are still housing applications on site. And the beauty is, as I've already mentioned, that we can now start to look at cloud services to run some of our key infrastructures. We're seeing CRM move into the cloud. We're seeing email, document collaboration, accounts packages. Sage are now running a number of their accounts packages in the cloud. But we've also seen a shift with Azure and Microsoft's infrastructure as a service platform, where organizations can actually start migrating physical servers or virtual servers that are today housed on premise out into an infrastructure managed and maintained by Microsoft and deployed by your Microsoft partner. So we have Windows Azure, Windows Server 2012 on-premise as an option, which also then integrates seamlessly to Microsoft Azure. So even if you wanted to purchase a Windows Server 2012, the investment in the hardware might not need to be as much as it would have been in the past. Some of the big costs around hardware is processor, and another big cost is storage. But with Windows Server 2012 or 2, you could actually integrate that from an on-premise server out into the cloud and have your back-end storage running within Azure. So you could have literally terabytes worth of storage running in a cloud-based scenario, but from an end-user point of view, they still connect to a local server, and it then securely connects them out into the storage within Azure. We're seeing Microsoft SQL Server and Microsoft System Center and those type of workloads move out into the cloud. And we see cloud options on demand, which obviously then reduce your cost and complexity in terms of management and ongoing costs. But it's also a rapid response to business, and what we mean by that is that if you need additional services, whether it's through Office 365 and additional users, or you need new servers, in the past you would have had to maybe place an order for a server. It might take 4 to 5 weeks. Whereas within Azure, if you place an order for the server or a number of servers or services to be deployed from Azure, assuming that your partner has adequate resources, there's no reason that that can't be deployed within the same day that you placed the order for it. Literally, servers can be spun up instantaneously within the Azure platform. And when we talk about a data center without boundaries, when you move to the cloud, it's very much removes any shackles of IT. I call it the onion layer approach to IT. Security, backup, all of that is now built into it in the cloud. So it really removes boundaries. Cloud computing opens you up to a world of working from anywhere. If all of your applications are hosted in Azure, couple that with email and collaboration from Office 365's point of view, you now have a fully hosted infrastructure within the cloud, allowing you to work from anywhere and off any device. And cloud also drives innovation. So you could look at doing things and delivering things in a completely different way. You might see a new way of being able to communicate, or a new way of designing a platform for you to interact with your customers. We can deliver dynamic application delivery through multiple levels of devices. And the beauty is that all of the services that are optimized within the cloud and built within the cloud automatically realize the type of device and the type of screen size that you're working from. The major benefits are speed of access, speed of turning on services, the resilience that's built in by default, cost efficiency. I can guarantee you I'm a long time selling cloud services. I've been doing it for over 7 years, and I'm yet to do a total cost of ownership that is not in favor of moving infrastructure services to the cloud. And then you also get the benefit of security. Microsoft invests a huge amount of money into the security of the data centers that they run these services from. Every data center is ISO 27701 certified. All of their employees are vetted. In terms of trying to find your information, the easiest way to describe this is if somebody was looking for your business's information, they're looking for a needle in a haystack, which they will never find. So when we talk about cloud innovating everywhere, again, we've talked very loosely around hybrid scenarios, Microsoft Azure, other service providers that you potentially might look to for CRM. It could be Salesforce, it could be anything. But one of the key pieces of the Microsoft cloud in particular is it's wrapped around there in the gray line with a fingerprint. It's called identity. Whether your storage is in Azure, your network is in Azure, your compute power, it's Office 365, or it's Salesforce, or it's anything, you can, using the elements that used to come within Microsoft System Center but are now built into an Azure offering called Identity Management, plug an identity management tool into your directory, so username and password, same way that you've always used today, to dial into your PC, and it will deliver you true single sign-on, whether it's into Dropbox, Salesforce, any other third party. Over 2,500 applications are supported by the identity service from Microsoft. And what Microsoft are trying to do with this particular play is make it even easier for you to adopt even that element of their cloud infrastructure just to manage other cloud elements of infrastructure that you may already be contemplating or looking at. And that tends to be a large concern for people in terms of management of these type of services. So we now come to the migration process, and it talks loosely around the 4 steps of the migration that we need to consider. We need to do the discovery phase, where we catalog the software and, more importantly, your workloads. The reason that we look at workloads is that when you go to move infrastructure into a scenario like Azure, where infrastructure now becomes a service, you don't actually have to pay for the service unless you're utilizing it. So consumption is king within the cloud. And what I mean by that is, if you're a type of business whose email is always on, as most are, that's fine. That would live within Office 365, and that will just tick along and is always on, always available. But if your accounts package, let's say, gets used from 8 a.m. in the morning to 5 p.m. in the evening, and after that nobody really dials into it, the advantage that you have with cloud infrastructure is that you can create a script that will power that server off overnight and power it back on automatically at 7:45 the following morning. And the beauty is that you're not paying for the consumption of that server during the time that it was off. Very, very clever use of resource from a Microsoft data center point of view, but the value back to the customer is that there are significant savings, because the reality of it is today we plug a server in and it runs quite literally until the day it decides to give up or we replace it. The next step is we assess, we categorize applications and workloads, we identify what is important to you as a line of business application. We then identify, can it move into the cloud, or does it have to stay on-premise, and are we looking at the design of a hybrid solution? Step 3 is we target the destination of where we're looking to house it. So if it's email and document collaboration, Office 365 will be the default for that. If it's a server infrastructure running Sage, running an ERP platform, or running any type of application, you might look to Azure. Or alternatively, it could be a legacy piece of software that can't go into Azure, so we need to find a secure way of deploying that on a server on-premise and then creating a hybrid environment with the other applications that might live in the cloud. And then the 4th step is to actually migrate. So once we've done all the planning, once we've done all of the risk mitigation, we actually go through that. So if we just have a quick look at each stage, when we look at Discover, we catalog the software and the workloads, and I've already discussed the reason that we do that. It's much easier to spec a server within Azure for an exact workload, i.e. we know the amount of data, the amount of processing power, and the amount of storage that server is going to need within business hours. Outside of business hours, that server can go asleep and you're not being charged. It also allows for organizations that have very busy periods of time, you can actually scale up your infrastructure. So if you have a large ERP system that has to manage a number of processes over a set period of time, we can actually scale up the horsepower of the server and allow it to grow seamlessly and then scale back down as soon as that job is complete. We then look at we've run a number of assessment tools and planning tools, as you can see, as the partner, and we look to make sure that we have a full picture of the overall infrastructure before we then recommend the move off to your destination. You can see here a number of things, and this is just an example of what you would get. The discovery phase, as you can see, will type into every server that you have and basically give you exactly what it is. Is it a server role? Is it a Microsoft app? It's a third-party app? Or in some cases, you can see here, it's a custom app. And each of those then will be dealt with in the appropriate way to make sure that your business continuity is kept running. We then assess your inventory, so we then do it in a number of ways. So you can see it as by type, by criticality, and then, well, that's a fancy word, and then by complexity and risk. So mission critical data, important, it's marginal, or it can be retired. These are the categories that we work across when we talk about critical. Obviously, what we do not want to do is cause any business disruption while we're going through this process. We'll identify server roles, are they a Microsoft application, custom, so forth, so on, and then low, medium, and high in terms of risk. We categorize what they are. When we identify risks, we then find out, can those risks be mitigated? If they can, we present that solution to you, make sure that you're happy with it. If they can't, we will find an alternative route for a safe migration. And again, the assess the inventory looks across, and you see a number of headings here. We either retire, it has a marginal risk, it's important, it's a critical. The complexity on a scale of 1 to 3, that tells us it's either low or hard. And again, the risk, the complexity between 1 to 3, low, hard. And you can see we begin to paint a very, very strong picture of what's going on within the infrastructure as we're running through this process. The next piece then is to target your destination. Evaluate the options for each application and workload. Is Windows Server 2012 or 2 going to be an option? It's an option for all. Is Azure an option? It could potentially be an option for all. Is it a Cloud OS network, and do you want to design your actual network infrastructure, i.e. DC, AD, and then have virtual switches within the cloud? Or are you looking at physical switches on-premise and connecting people to that? And then Office 365, how can that come in? Is collaboration, is communication key to part and parcel of your strategy? Will we move email into that? Will you change your Office licensing model by adopting downloads of Office from Office 365? We will assess each of them, as it says there, by each application and the type of workload that is needed. If it's a third party or a bespoke application, it could be possible that it won't be supported within Azure. By default, we'll have to house that on a Windows Server 2012. As I had said earlier, however, the data that is stored by that application could live within Azure, therefore reducing the complexity and cost on that server and the maintenance of that server, because the data is off out in Azure, secured and being backed up within Azure, allowing you to burst your infrastructure out into the cloud in a very simple and short way. When we get to the migration stage, the Windows Server 2012, you can see here just a quick brief on that. Enterprise class scale and performance, shared living, remote direct access, Hyper-V is built in by default, has been since Server 2008. Low enough cost, high availability, file-based storage. And what they talk about that is they talk about the Azure piece. So it is low cost, it's highly available, and file-based storage in the cloud. Backup recovery by default. Even if we had to keep data onto the premise, it will integrate into Azure backup services seamlessly. Windows Server 2012 is designed for hybrid applications, so it can integrate quite nicely and do identity management. It runs on Windows PowerShell 4.0 to integrate into the backends for the techies out there. We have a huge amount of skills in that. An awful lot of our customers don't have skills in PowerShell. We do, and do a huge amount of scripting to make sure that the hybrid deployment is solid and secure. And then it's a simplified feature-rich virtual desktop infrastructure that can be supported through Windows Server 2012 and RDS. If virtual desktop infrastructure is something that is of interest to you, we can have a lengthy conversation with one of my colleagues who has deployed a solution like that into a number of hospitals for security reasons and so forth and so on. And that's all built on a combination of Windows Server 2012 R2 and Azure for storage. Microsoft Azure delivers across 4 different platforms. Web hosting, so if you have a website and you're interested in web hosting, you can scale very easily within Azure. IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, which is the next box. PaaS, which is platform as a service, and then that is direct attached storage as a service, and network. So we talk about compute, data services, app services, network. You can see all of the different services that run in there. The difficulty with Azure is that if you're just an everyday customer who decides, I'm going to go onto the Azure website and have a look at this, the downside to trying to do that, trying to get your head around it, is that Azure changes every 3 months. Literally every 3 months, the services that are running from Azure are added to, they are tweaked, they are made better in terms of performance. So if I was to pick one particular one and go to app services and talk about the media services element, the media services element is actually the service that the BBC chose to run their coverage of the recent Olympics, and they were streaming for all types of devices on a global scale, whether it was an iPhone, whether it was an iPad, whether it was an Android device. They were running high definition media services across that. That gives you an idea of the type of compute power. We've seen a huge amount of organizations moving towards that compute power and looking at virtual machines, websites, and even delivering mobile services for specific applications. So one thing that most people don't realize is that Azure will also give you an ability to create mobile applications so that you can get your line of business applications down to the end users that you need to. Azure is a very, very vast tool. It's very important that you find yourself a partner who understands Azure and then goes through the migration process, as we've already discussed. In that way, we discover, assess, target, and then you come up with your safe migration plan. So Office 365, then I'm sure that most people at this stage now are familiar with Office 365. That is a huge complement to any strategy that you're looking at, and in most cases, particularly with ourselves, is the first stepping stone for a number of our customers to look at cloud computing. Office 365 delivers file sharing, collaboration through SharePoint and OneDrive for Business, Exchange is your business class email, which you already use today or use a variant of, and now Link, or as it's known, Skype for Business, which is a hugely beneficial communication tool that can absolutely and utterly transform how you communicate, not just internally, but also externally with your customers. We've seen some great examples of our customers utilizing some of the technologies within Office 365 to transform how they deliver their services to the customers that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. The Cloud OS network then, so from your hybrid data center, you can really design a massive amount of integration across a number, and I've already mentioned this, the Microsoft platform will allow you to start thinking about your IT in a slightly different way. In the past, we all used to think about, for every application, we needed a physical server. The reality of the situation that we now live in today, for every application, we are looking at either housing that within an infrastructure service like Azure, or finding a partner, whether it's Salesforce, whether it's any type of ERP system, a CRM platform, Sage accounts package. We are now looking at maybe managing multiple vendors and having the ability to spin up their services across the platforms. This talks about, again, coming to Windows Server 2012 and the ability to have a more powerful platform. It does require more powerful hardware, and that does obviously bring the price of the server itself up. So you can replace the server hardware or the 2003 box with a physical piece of tin. You can virtualize on a server once it's designed and built, or you can relocate to the cloud. Do bear in mind that the most recent updates of service or servers under the Windows Server 2002, they do require a significant amount of horsepower, which will bring up the price of the hardware, which is why it's beginning to look very attractive for organizations to start moving towards the cloud. This talks about the number of different server roles that we can have with a Windows Server. It can operate as a file server, web server, Active Directory, terminal server, and then an application server. You're familiar with a number of these, but the ability is that with Windows Server 2012, you can deliver these through physical. So when we load it onto the physical tin, you can actually create a virtual environment, and you're entitled then to virtualize all of these server roles if you want. So you can see there, we can deliver it over a hypervisor, or you can also look to Microsoft Azure and deliver your file server, as I've already mentioned, using StoreSimple or Azure Storage. The web server is absolutely something that we already start looking at moving out into Azure, and a majority of organizations have already moved that out. I won't dwell too much on that. The Active Directory is the element that basically allows us to sign into everything that we use on a day-to-day basis. Again, that can live within the physical box, or again, that now can run as a service within Azure infrastructure as a service. The terminal server, again, can live on hardware or live on Azure. I think you get the picture with the ability that we can do. The entire Azure platform is built currently on Windows Server 2012. The reality of it is that Microsoft will be updating that and the application servers that will be running there to the new version of Windows Server within the next 12 to 14 months. You will get access to that immediately when you're using the you will be waiting for a period of time before you get access to that new technology. When we come to custom and third-party applications, we do treat them a slight bit different. What we do is we realize that they can absolutely live in most cases on a Windows server, and in most they will live in a virtual environment. So they won't install physically onto the server. We'll have to kind of create a virtual environment for them to install. There is the opportunity of looking at Azure infrastructure platform or software as a service potentially. And when we come to software as a service, that realistically talks about finding a new way of delivering that third-party application. Third-party applications are something that we tend to end up creating hybrid environments for, because they do tend to be line of business applications and the organization can't do without them. The difficulty is that when you go to replace them, it tends to run into very significant and high costs. So we always, during the assess and discover stage, treat third-party applications and custom applications with a significant amount of respect and detail, because they tend to be the linchpin in most cases for organizations in terms of their line of business applications. So then we come to the migrating the applications. You can migrate as is, so the application will be migrated without a change, and in most cases with virtual environments that tends to be the case. We have to find an alternative, so we use a different app or a SaaS offering to achieve the same business result. That can in some cases work, and in other cases can't work because of some customizations. But again, we kind of get through that with the assessment point. We can repair, rewrite, or refactor, so we modify the actual application itself to work within the new platform, or we use technology to counter the incompatibilities like virtualization or an alternative like that. And then the final piece is that we upgrade. So the application in some cases needs to be upgraded to the latest version in order to support the new environment, whether it's Windows Server 2012 or the Azure environment. When we talk about Microsoft applications, SharePoint, SQL, and Exchange, all of these can move very seamlessly out into, as you can see, Azure. They're already running as services. The cost of deploying these, I will say, on-premise has become significantly more expensive, particularly SQL, which has year on year since the launch of Azure received a 20% increase to its price. So that's where the TCO really comes into play. So there is a financial element and a financial understanding that you need to come to when you're looking at the upgrade of your services. Exchange server, I think at this stage the majority of people are running it within Office 365. When it comes to an Exchange renewal, if you're not doing it on-premise, the majority of people are doing it in Office 365. I haven't actually come across, although it's possible to do it within Azure, I haven't come across anybody do so, as it's more cost effective to just put it into Office 365, where mailboxes start as little as $260 per user per month. SharePoint. SharePoint is a little bit of a complicated one. If you've never used SharePoint before, I would absolutely recommend using Office 365 for the place for it to start. However, if you have SharePoint on-premise, if it's 2007, if it's the latest version, which is 2013, or the one in between, which is 2010, that will lead itself to some complications. What we would look to do there is if you were looking to get that to the cloud, we would absolutely put it within Azure, and we would move it as is, because when you come across SharePoint deployments, the truth of it is that there tends to be a huge amount of customization and workflows built in. So we can actually take the virtual image of that server and move it into the Azure infrastructure as it is, and it will work and behave the exact same way. Again, if you haven't used SharePoint before, it will be an optimal experience for you to go straight out of the box and sign into Office 365. or alternatively, as is always the option, you buy new hardware, a new server, and put it on premise. So once you realize your target destination, the next step then is your journey and what applications we're going to move. After the discovery phase, after the assess phase, we understand the risks. What we now need to decide is what are we going to move and what is that journey going to look like. So when we then get to the migrate stage, there's lots of different options. We can do it yourself, you can change service offerings, you can plan and then execute. And ultimately what we tend to do is we tend to work with organizations of all sizes. Organizations who are smaller, they tend to ask us to do the majority of the work. As we come up the food chain and organizations have IT people and personnel, we tend to work with them on a consultancy basis and help them design their migration phase where we do a number of workloads and they do a number of workloads. The next steps are very much about getting started today. Find out a smooth, successful server migration, and then take the time out to plan and execute that. Choose your partner or decide what strategy that you're going to go with. Take advantage of the innovations within Windows Server, the new hardware itself, the new OS, and the ability for it to integrate into the cloud. But I would also say that if you are at this stage, having a look at Windows Server 2012, again, depending on the infrastructure that you're looking to move, it might be worth your while to skip the Windows Server 2012 on-premise experience and go straight into a service like Azure and run your servers within Azure. We have a number of resources that you can have a look at. There's the migration website that Microsoft have. We'll distribute some of these links, as well as our own pages on our own MJFT site where you can happily come along and have a look at that, or even contact ourselves to kind of understand what the next steps would for your organization would be. That brings us to the end of the presentation, folks. I hope you found it of use. At this stage, if there are any questions, I will happily answer them if you want to either come off mute or alternatively just type out the question. I'd like to thank you all for your time and look forward to speaking to you again.